Or maybe it's been a bad week, a bad few months, a bad year. You can't get steady. You can't feel settled. It feels like you just can't quite get your feet back on solid ground. Everything's shifting and you don't really know which way is up. You don't know what to do. You don't know who to call. Who do you reach for? Where do you turn? How can you find some stability, some safety? We all have to weather storms of some sort or another, literal and metaphorical, at some point in our lives. It's part of being human. And if we're honest, some of the storms that we face are of our own making. Situation we've created through carelessness or stupidity, or just by being fragile human beings, as we all are. And then there are the storms that don't really belong to us. They surround other people, their lives and situations and relationships. And yet somehow we find ourselves getting dragged in, sucked up in the whirl of chaos, either intentionally or against our will, sharing in their turmoil through love, necessity, or circumstance. But some storms come out of nowhere, uninvited, unpredictable, unforeseen. No one's to blame. They're just a reality of life. And this last category is exactly the kind of storm that the disciples faced on the Sea of Galilee in today's reading from Mark's Gospel. Because of the very particular geographical nature of the Sea of Galilee, which was actually just a really big lake, storms could descend very quickly, very violently, without warning, putting any boat and its crew at immediate and serious risk. So it's not surprising that everyone on board the boat has begun to panic. They were just trying to get from A to B, just trying to go to the other side, what should have been a very straightforward journey. They hadn't bargained on gale force winds and giant waves. Well, not quite everyone was panicking, of course. There was one member of the crew who was so relaxed as to be actually snoring in the stern of the boat. Jesus. A little too relaxed for everyone else's liking. What on earth was he playing at? This was no time to sleep. Didn't he know that they were all in very serious trouble? The disciples seemed to be appalled by his sheer audacity. And isn't it interesting that when they shake him into consciousness, the first thing they say to him isn't save us, but teacher, don't you care that we're about to die? They aren't waking him so that he can fix everything. They're actually waking him because they're frightened and they want him to see and share in their terror. They say that misery loves company, and it's true. One of our greatest and perhaps most overlooked needs when we're afraid or sad is companionship. We need someone to see and know and understand and be with us in our storm. That was what the disciples were looking for. They never expected anything more. They hadn't actually assumed that Jesus could do anything about the grave situation facing them. They didn't know the end of the story like we do. And yet he surpasses their expectations. They call him teacher, but in the next moment he reveals himself as God, one with power over the wind and the waves, one who can tell the storm to take a hike. This is not what they were expecting. Who is this guy? They ask each other. You can almost imagine Jesus shaking his head in despair. They still haven't got it. If only they had truly recognized who was in the boat with them, they needn't have been even the tiniest bit worried. But maybe that's asking too much. And I can't help but wonder, what if Jesus didn't wake up? What if the men had been so distracted and panicked by the storm that they didn't rouse him? Might they have drowned because their saviour needed his shut-eye? We often assume, or at least I tend to, that the reason the men were saved, the reason they survived at all, was because they woke Jesus and then he calmed the storm. but maybe they were never in mortal danger. Maybe they didn't need to worry. Maybe the reason Jesus slept was because he knew that the storm wasn't going to overwhelm them in the first place. Maybe he performed this miracle not to save their lives, but to reassure his terrified friends. Maybe he calmed the physical storm in response to the emotional storm that he saw in his disciples. Maybe. The way we respond to the storms of life can be a revealing test of where our trust really lies. But that doesn't mean that we should engage in a kind of forced optimism, a determination that if we will it to be so, everything will be okay. Just pretend, just imagine, and it will be okay. Because the reality is that the storms that so many of us face rage on regardless. Sometimes they pass quickly, quicker than we might imagine, quicker than we expect, but sometimes they tear through our lives, doing damage to us and to the people and the things that we value for far longer than we might have predicted. And sometimes it feels like our God is sleeping in the midst of it all, oblivious to the suffering that surrounds him. And it's okay to want to shake him, to force him to open his eyes, to demand of him, can't you see what is happening? Don't you care? That is perhaps the most honest form of prayer, but it's also one of the hardest. But if we have the courage to pray it, we're in really good company, because faithful people have been asking this question of God for centuries. You only have to look at the Psalms to see that. In Psalm 13, the psalmist cries out, "How long, O Lord? Are you going to forget me forever? How long are you going to hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and sorrow in my heart? How long?" Many of us can't quite bear to ask that question of God. Don't you care? What if all we get back is an echoing silence? Perhaps sometimes it's even easier to assume that he's not even in the boat at all, let alone taking an interest in the storm that's threatening to overwhelm us. But when we muster the courage to ask that question, we might just be surprised at the answer we receive. Recently, I was with a friend who is in the midst of one of the worst storms of life that you could possibly imagine. The kind of tragedy that nobody sees coming and that everyone else is just thankful that it's not happening to them. The kind of storm that is so big and so terrible that it could easily sweep you away like an ant on a leaf. She remains in the midst of that storm. But I want to share with you something that she said recently, because it stopped me in my tracks completely. She said, "I have entered into my deepest nightmare, and God was there." I have entered into my deepest nightmare, and God was there. By all accounts and by all logic, this storm should have utterly overwhelmed and destroyed her. But in the midst of it, she has a very clear sense that she is being held and supported and carried through by her God. He is her companion in this storm, and he will not permit her to be overwhelmed. Because let's face it, God doesn't always calm our storms. And he certainly doesn't stop them rolling in over the horizon when we least expect it. But he never gets out of the boat. His presence is the promise that we will not be overwhelmed. By his presence, he can calm the storm within us, even as the storm outside continues to rage. And I wonder if that's why Jesus was taken aback at the disciples' panic. They should have known that his presence was the guarantee of their safety. We're going to have a few moments of silence in a minute, after which we'll have some music. And in that time, I want to invite you to consider where you see yourself in today's story from Mark's Gospel. Perhaps you're a disciple, beset by challenge and anxiety and circumstances. Maybe life feels overwhelming and threatening and out of control. Maybe you're scared because you don't know how the story ends. Perhaps you want to shake God awake and say to him, "Don't you care?" Or maybe you're the waves, tossed backwards and forwards by things beyond your control, all along just yearning for stability, just longing for peace to be spoken into your life. Perhaps you're the sleeping saviour, tucked up cosy on your cushion in the stern, while real life, with all its messiness, rages around you. Is it time to wake up? What might you see? What might you do? Or maybe you're somewhere else entirely in the story. Maybe you're a friend waiting on the shore, witnessing it all from afar, just desperate you could do something. In the silence now, just sit with that image of where you are. Think about it. Think about how it makes you feel. Think about where God is in this with you. Offer that to God.